As long as cars have existed, people have wanted to drive them, even when those cars weren't built with them in mind. The conveniences found in modern cars are monumental in assisting those who really need it, and sometimes quirky design choices are less about being different and more about accessibility. In this video, I'm going to talk about how accessible cars went from DIY solutions to a product so expensive it's inaccessible all over again. The first well-recorded instance of an accessible car is thanks to Frank Fythen. He found ways to make life work for him after having lost his arms as a kid. By the 1910s, this included cars, which is pretty impressive because they weren't exactly commonplace yet. He customized a steering wheel to work with his residual limbs and traveled the country, selling postcards of himself to make a living. At the same time, another man was working on making cars accessible to his unique needs. Like Fythen, Quentin Corley had also suffered an injury requiring amputation, but not in the exact same way, so he had to come up with his own design. He added a ring to the steering wheel so he could steer easily with just his one arm, and he added an extra floor pedal so he could accelerate with his feet, which wasn't standard back then, but is now. So while these two specific designs were made for their specific drivers, Charles Kettering was inventing the self-starter, or electric starter. No longer did you have to manually crank start a car, it would just start. This was big for accessibility, for both those who didn't have the strength to hand crank an engine, and those who may have mobility issues that didn't quite warrant major modifications to their vehicles. So far, modifications were only available to those who still had use of both of their legs. And even President Franklin Roosevelt had to have accessible cars special made so he could continue to drive himself after becoming paralyzed. This meant moving all the floor controls to be accessible by hand in a very strategic fashion so steering could be done with one hand and everything else with the other, while also leaving the floor controls intact so others could drive if necessary. Like most people, it was important to him to maintain his independence and show his country that he was not weak, regardless of his physical ability. It wasn't just his cars that had to be modified. Any car he had to be in, like his famous convertible limousine, was custom made so that it was easier for him to get in and out of. In cases like his, just having an automatic transmission wouldn't have been enough to make it accessible, but for many it would. Now, automatic transmissions had been in the works since the early 1900s, but it wasn't until 1939 that they started being mass-produced, and it would still take a while to fully catch on. By the end of World War II, the automobile was now a regular part of life, and therefore forced American auto manufacturers to make vehicles accessible for newly disabled veterans. General Motors and Ford were the first to start making various accessible vehicles based on the individual's needs, with the intent to help them transition back into normal life seamlessly. There were even order forms for these accessible cars depending on which limbs you still had, which is a very gruesome reality. These modifications were offered for free, though you did have to pay for the car itself. This is very different from today, where accessibility modification may cost as much as the car itself. So by the 1950s, unmodified cars were the most accessible they had ever been, but there were still many innovations to be made. These advancements were basically exclusively engineered by disabled people, just like they had been in the past. Better hand controls were developed by Alan Ruprecht, who found hand controls of the past to be cumbersome, expensive, and poorly made. He designed new controls to fit any vehicle, which were easy to install and able to be mass-produced. A major part of accessibility is not just how it assists the person, but how easily they can even get the product. Accessibility starts to lose its meaning when only wealthy people can access it. He continued to work towards more widespread vehicle accessibility for people, branching out to more leg-centric driving modifications and wheelchair accessibility. His company, DriveMaster, is still around and still prioritizes keeping costs as low as possible for their customers. He wasn't the only one thinking of wheelchair users at this time, though. Ralph Braun was working on building his own motorized wheelchair. He was one of the first to build this type of mobility scooter, but what good is a scooter if you're still limited to your neighborhood? So he came up with a way to get his scooter into a van using a lift, and then he could also drive it. When Chrysler popularized the minivan in the 80s, Braun started modifying those as well, and it was a big hit. When I think of a wheelchair accessible van, I do think of a Chrysler minivan, so clearly he was incredibly successful in this venture. And minivans are still modified by his company to this day. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and while it's not always perfectly executed, it has significantly helped those who need accommodations. But like I mentioned before, cars are still often inaccessible. Not because of lack of accessories or modifications available, but because getting those things can be too expensive for the average person. Insurance and Medicaid can cover some or sometimes all of the cost of accessibility devices for a car, but if you need it to be wheelchair accessible, you will probably have to pay out of pocket. And these cars are not cheap. For a new one, you're looking at up to $100,000 for a minivan. Obviously, used ones can be cheaper, but they're still more expensive than their unmodified counterparts. There are grant programs in place to help people with this, but they're not a guarantee and may not even cover the majority of the cost. So this is still a major hurdle for a lot of people, and it can't be overstated how small your world becomes when you lack that type of independence. Now, outside of everything I've been talking about, there are many ways cars are accessible beyond special made devices. While some of these features are universally accepted, like power steering, others are kind of controversial. Tesla has great examples of this. The steering yoke is a great option for those who may have a limited range of motion or need the extra leg space when they're moving in or out of the car. Alongside this, drive-by-wire systems also help minimize the effort needed to operate a car, since it replaces physical mechanical parts like the steering column with electronics. You might not think that regular driving is all that intensive, but for some people it could easily cause fatigue and pain, even during a short trip, and just a small adjustment to the effort required can change that. You may not think much about cruise control, for example, but it's basically the same idea. Less effort makes driving more comfortable, regardless of your ability. Accessibility often hides in plain sight when you are not the one who needs it. Now, I'm not saying the Cybertruck is the perfect accessible vehicle, but it does utilize technology that can go a long way in making driving reasonable for more people, whether that was the intent or not. When you see something that seems silly or redundant or makes you think why, it could be an accessibility feature. Unfortunately though, even unmodified cars that have these unique accessibility features, like the Cybertruck, are still typically too expensive. But these types of innovations tend to trickle down and become affordable. Power steering was initially only available in top-of-the-line cars, but now it's standard. Ultimately, that's really what it's all about, making things as accessible as possible for as many people as possible at the right price.